Chapter 1. The numbers are moving on the screen and there's no reaction. No spike of excitement, no tightening in the chest, no internal commentary about what this could turn into if it keeps going. Just a glance, a quiet acknowledgement, and attention shifts back to the chart structure instead of the balance. If you've never experienced that state, it probably sounds fake or forced, like something people pretend to have once they've made it. But the truth is, this moment doesn't come from having a lot of money. It comes from something breaking internally long before the account ever grows. Most traders experience the opposite. The moment price moves in their favor, their body reacts before their mind does. Heart rate picks up. Thoughts accelerate. They start calculating outcomes instead of managing process. When price moves against them, the reaction is even faster. Tension, anxiety, a subtle urge to interfere. The money isn't just money anymore, it's emotional leverage. It decides how the trade feels, how the day feels, sometimes how the person feels about themselves. And once money has that kind of power, it's no longer just capital. It's a trigger. There's a moment that happens early in most trading journeys where money becomes symbolic. At first, it's just numbers. Then it starts to represent progress, then competence, then validation, then relief. For some people, it even becomes proof that they're not wasting their time or potential. That's when trading stops being a technical activity and turns into an emotional one. And from that point on, every decision is heavier than it should be. You can see this play out in real time. A trader enters a position that fits their plan perfectly, clean setup, proper risk, nothing unusual. But the moment they're in, the mind shifts. They're no longer observing price, they're observing how much they're up or down. The chart becomes secondary, the PNL becomes primary. And once that happens, execution starts bending. Stops get adjusted emotionally. Targets get negotiated. The trade stops being managed and starts being felt. This is where the idea of not caring about money gets misunderstood. People hear that phrase and assume it means recklessness, or arrogance, or being numb. They imagine someone who's detached because they're rich enough not to worry. That's not what this is. The trader who doesn't care about money is not indifferent to risk. They're deeply respectful of it. They just no longer allow money to dictate their emotional state in the moment. And that difference changes everything. Think about the last time you closed a trade early because you didn't want to give back profits. Not because your plan said to exit, but because the number felt too good to lose. Or the last time you held a loser longer than you should have because accepting the loss felt like admitting something about yourself. Those decisions don't come from lack of knowledge. They come from money having emotional authority. And as long as it does, trading will always feel heavier than it needs to. There's a quiet fatigue that builds when every trade matters too much, when every session feels like a test, when wins feel like relief and losses feel like setbacks instead of data points. That fatigue doesn't show up as burnout right away. It shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as constant internal negotiation. Traders call it psychology issues, but it's not vague or mysterious. It's the natural result of attaching personal meaning to financial outcomes repeatedly. The traders who eventually stop caring about money don't do it intentionally at first. It happens as a byproduct of repetition, of seeing the same emotional patterns play out again and again, of watching how excitement leads to mistakes just as reliably as fear does. At some point, something clicks. Not in a dramatic way, more like resignation. A quiet realization that reacting emotionally to money has never improved a single decision. That realization doesn't make someone emotionless. It makes them selective. They start noticing how little information emotion actually provides in trading, how often it pushes toward action instead of clarity, how rarely it aligns with long-term outcomes. And once that awareness sets in, caring deeply about money in the moment starts to feel counterproductive rather than motivating. This is where contrast starts to emerge. Two traders can take the same setup with the same risk and have completely different experiences. One is tense, hyper-focused on outcome, mentally projecting into the future. The other is calm, focused on execution, already detached from whatever the result will be. The difference isn't confidence, it's relationship. One is trading money, the other is trading a process that happens to involve money. If you've ever felt like trading controls your mood more than it should, you're not broken. You're just early in this shift. Most people start by caring too much. That's normal. Money is powerful. It affects real life. It's tied to survival, freedom, status. Expecting to be neutral around it immediately is unrealistic. The problem isn't caring at first. The problem is never outgrowing that attachment. You can feel when someone hasn't. They talk about money constantly, not just in results, but in tone. Everything is framed around gains, losses, numbers, percentages. Even their identity as a trader is tied to how much they're making right now. When they're up, they feel competent. When they're down, they feel exposed. That volatility isn't market driven, it's internal. And it's exhausting to sustain long term. The traders who stop caring about money don't stop respecting it. They stop personalizing it. Money becomes a measurement, not a verdict, a variable, not a judge. That shift doesn't happen because someone tells them to think differently. It happens because they've seen enough cycles to know that emotional involvement has a cost, and that cost compounds just as reliably as bad habits do. There's a strange calm that shows up once money loses its emotional grip. Trades feel lighter, decisions feel cleaner. Losses sting less, not because they're smaller, but because they're expected. Wins don't inflate confidence as much because they're not interpreted as proof of superiority. Everything evens out, and that evenness is uncomfortable at first because it removes the highs that kept people engaged early on. If you're watching this and thinking that detachment sounds boring, that reaction matters. It usually means part of you is still using trading as stimulation instead of execution. That's not a judgment, it's an observation. Many traders come to the market not just to make money, but to feel something: purpose, excitement, validation. Detachment threatens that, which is why it's resisted until the cost of attachment becomes undeniable. There's often a moment when that cost becomes clear. It might be after a big win that leads to overconfidence and a string of losses, or after a long grind where nothing sticks because emotions keep interfering, or after realizing that years of effort haven't translated into stability. That moment doesn't feel enlightening, it feels disappointing, like recognizing a pattern you wish wasn't there. That disappointment is important. It creates space. Space to question whether caring this much about money is actually helping. Space to notice how often money has been the reason for deviating from plan. Space to consider that maybe the traders who seem calm aren't less ambitious, but more grounded, more willing to let money be a tool instead of a measure of self-worth. If this chapter feels uncomfortably accurate, pause and like the video. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. These realizations tend to slip away if they are not marked, and the entire shift we're talking about starts with noticing, not fixing. You don't stop caring about money by force. You stop caring by seeing clearly how much caring has cost you. Most traders never reach that point. They keep chasing better strategies, better entries, better timing, hoping something external will solve an internal problem. But the psychology of a trader who doesn't care about money isn't built on better tools. It's built on letting go of the idea that money should dictate emotional state in the first place. In the next chapter, we're going to sit inside the tension most traders feel when they hear this idea. The fear that if they stop caring about money, they'll lose motivation. That detachment will turn into laziness. That urgency is the only thing keeping them sharp. That fear is common, and it's also one of the biggest misunderstandings in trading psychology. Chapter 2. The resistance usually shows up immediately after that thought lands. The idea that if money stops mattering, effort will drop with it. That urgency is the engine. That pressure is what keeps you sharp. That without caring deeply about the outcome, you'll drift, lose focus, start treating trades casually. It's a reasonable fear. It feels logical. And it's one of the main reasons traders cling to emotional attachment long after it stopped serving them. You can feel this fear in how people react to the idea of detachment. They tense up. They imagine someone apathetic, sloppy, disconnected. Someone who doesn't try hard enough because there's no emotional stake. But that picture is built on a misunderstanding of what actually drives clean execution. Fear doesn't create precision, it creates urgency. And urgency is noisy. It rushes decisions. It narrows perception. It makes traders act sooner, not better. Think about how you behave when a trade really matters to you. Not technically, but emotionally. When you need it to work. When you're hoping it'll fix the day or justify the week, your attention doesn't get sharper, it gets scattered. You check the chart more often. You watch every tick. You start imagining outcomes before they happen. You're mentally ahead of price instead of present with it. That's not focus. That's anxiety wearing the mask of commitment. The traders who don't care about money are often the most precise in execution, not because they're gifted, but because their attention isn't being pulled in two directions at once. They're not managing a trade and their emotions simultaneously. They're not negotiating with themselves mid position. Their mental bandwidth is freed up for what actually matters: structure, context, process. When money loses emotional weight, clarity increases, not effort decreases. There's also a deeper layer to this fear. For many traders, caring about money is tied to identity. It's how they measure whether they're progressing, improving, becoming someone worth taking seriously. Letting go of that attachment can feel like letting go of purpose. If the money doesn't matter, what does? That question can be unsettling, especially if trading has become more than just an activity. If it's become a way to validate intelligence, discipline, or potential. This is why detachment often feels threatening before it feels freeing. It asks you to remove money from the role it's been playing emotionally. And that role might be bigger than you want to admit. Money might be the thing that tells you whether today was good or bad, whether you're on track or falling behind, whether this is all worth it. Taking that away doesn't immediately replace it with something else. There's a gap, and most people rush to fill gaps instead of sitting with them. You can see this in traders who say they want to be detached, but still obsess over results. They'll talk about process, but react emotionally to every outcome, and they'll say money doesn't matter, but feel their mood shift with every fluctuation. That's not hypocrisy. That's transition. Detachment isn't something you decide. It's something you grow into once the cost of attachment outweighs the comfort it provides. There's also a misconception that caring less about money means caring less about risk. It's actually the opposite. When money loses emotional charge, risk becomes clearer. You stop downplaying it when you're excited. You stop exaggerating it when you're afraid. You see it for what it is: a variable to be managed, not a threat to be avoided or a lever to be pulled. That clarity leads to better risk decisions, not looser ones. Notice how often mistakes happen at emotional extremes. Big wins lead to overconfidence. Big losses lead to hesitation or revenge. Both come from caring too much about what money says in that moment. The trader who doesn't care about money doesn't swing between those extremes as violently. Their emotional range narrows, not because they are numb, but because fewer things feel personally meaningful. And that narrower range creates consistency. This is the part most traders don't realize until they experience it themselves. Motivation doesn't disappear when money stops mattering emotionally. It shifts. It moves away from outcome and toward execution, away from proving something and toward doing something correctly. That kind of motivation is quieter but far more stable. It doesn't spike and crash. It doesn't need constant reinforcement. It just hums in the background, steady enough to rely on. You can feel the difference when you trade from that place. You're not trying to win the trade. You're trying to execute it cleanly. You're not hoping the market gives you something. You're responding to what it's already offering. There's no internal cheering or dread, just observation and response. That state doesn't feel dramatic, but it's efficient. And efficiency compounds faster than intensity ever will. If you've ever noticed that your best trades were the ones you didn't care about as much, that's not coincidence. Those trades weren't weighed down by expectation. You weren't projecting into the future. You weren't emotionally invested in the outcome. You were just present. The irony is that traders often try to recreate that state by caring more, not realizing that caring less is what allowed it to exist in the first place. There's also a long-term cost to using money as motivation that people rarely account for: emotional burnout. When every trade matters, every loss drains you. When every win is relief, you never actually relax. You're constantly oscillating between tension and release. That cycle is exhausting, and eventually something gives. Either discipline slips, or interest fades, or frustration takes over. Detachment breaks that cycle by flattening the emotional swings. This doesn't mean trading becomes passionless. It becomes sustainable. There's a difference. Passion fueled by emotion burns hot and fast. Engagement fueled by clarity burns slow and steady. The traders who last aren't the ones who felt the most. They're the ones who learned how to feel less without becoming careless. That balance is subtle, and it's why it's misunderstood so often. If you're feeling a mix of agreement and resistance right now, that's a good sign. It means you're not rejecting the idea outright, but you're not fully comfortable with it either. That discomfort is where the shift actually happens. If this is hitting close, take a moment and like the video. Not to endorse the idea, but to mark the moment you're considering something that challenges how you've been operating emotionally. The fear that detachment leads to laziness comes from equating emotional pressure with productivity. In reality, emotional pressure is just noise. It creates activity, not accuracy. The trader who doesn't care about money isn't less driven. They're just driven by something more reliable than fear or hope. They're driven by consistency, by mastery, by the quiet satisfaction of doing something well, regardless of outcome. Chapter 3. Most traders never reach the point where money loses its emotional grip because they never question the role it's playing in their lives. They assume the anxiety, the urgency, the obsession are just part of trading. That stress becomes normalized. It's worn like a badge of seriousness. If you're tense, you must care. If you're anxious, you must be committed. If you're emotionally drained, you must be pushing yourself. That story is rarely challenged because it feels productive, even when it's destructive. There's usually something underneath the attachment to money that has nothing to do with trading itself. For some people, it's a timeline, a sense that they're behind where they should be by now. For others, it's comparison, watching peers move forward while they feel stuck. For others, it's identity, the idea that trading success proves intelligence, discipline, or worth. Money becomes the scoreboard for all of that. And once it's doing that job, it's no longer just capital. It's carrying emotional weight it was never meant to hold. This is why advice about mindset often falls flat. Telling someone to stop caring about money without addressing why they care is pointless. The attachment isn't intellectual, it's emotional. It's rooted in pressure, expectation, and unresolved narratives about success. Until those narratives are confronted, money will continue to feel heavy, no matter how much experience someone gains. They can learn better strategies, better risk management, better execution, and still feel hijacked the moment they're in a trade. You can see this in traders who have technically improved over time, but feel worse than they did at the beginning. They know more. They understand structure. They see the market more clearly, but they're more stressed, more reactive, more self-critical. That's not because trading got harder. It's because money became more meaningful. The stakes didn't just increase financially, they increased psychologically. More time invested means more to lose emotionally. And that emotional load distorts decision-making in subtle ways. One of the hardest things for traders to accept is that caring deeply about money often comes from a desire for certainty. Certainty that the effort is worth it. Certainty that they're on the right path. Certainty that they're not wasting time. Money provides a tangible metric for those questions. When the balance goes up, things feel justified. When it goes down, doubt creeps in. Detachment threatens that certainty. It removes the easy answer to whether things are working, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for most people. This is where control sneaks in. Traders try to control outcomes emotionally even when they can't control the market. They watch P&L obsessively. They intervene early. They micromanage positions. All of it is an attempt to reduce uncertainty, to feel like they're doing something to protect themselves from disappointment. But that control is an illusion. It doesn't reduce uncertainty. It just adds another layer of interference between intention and execution. The traders who don't care about money have usually gone through a period where caring too much clearly hurt them. Not in an abstract way, but in repeated, undeniable patterns. They've seen how excitement led to overtrading, how fear led to hesitation, how attachment led to poor exits. Eventually, the evidence piles up. It becomes impossible to ignore, and that's when detachment stops being an idea and starts being a survival mechanism. There's often a single experience that crystallizes this shift, not a dramatic blowup, but a moment of recognition. A trader notices they broke their own rules not because the setup demanded it, but because they were emotionally invested in the outcome. Or they realize they executed perfectly but still felt miserable because the result wasn't what they hoped. Or they notice that the trades they felt nothing about were the ones they handled best. That contrast plants a seed that doesn't go away easily. Once that seed is there, money starts to lose some of its authority. Not all at once, gradually. The trader becomes more aware of emotional reactions as they happen. They start noticing the urge to check P&L, to intervene, to justify, and instead of acting on it automatically, they pause. Not to suppress the feeling, but to observe it. That observation alone creates distance. and distance is the beginning of detachment. This is also where people get stuck. They become aware of their emotional reactions but don't know what to do with them. They try to force detachment. They tell themselves money shouldn't matter. They shame themselves for caring. That doesn't work. Detachment isn't the absence of feeling, it's the absence of obedience. You can feel anxious and still execute cleanly. You can feel excited and still stick to plan. The goal isn't emotional numbness, it's emotional irrelevance during decision making. Most traders never make that distinction. They think the presence of emotion is the problem. It's not. The problem is letting emotion dictate behavior. The trader who doesn't care about money still feels emotions. They just don't treat those emotions as instructions. A spike of excitement doesn't mean add size. A wave of fear doesn't mean exit early. Feelings are noticed, acknowledged, and then ignored. That skill takes time to develop, and most people don't stay in the game long enough to build it. There's also a social cost to detachment that people don't talk about. When you stop caring about money emotionally, you stop participating in certain conversations. You're less impressed by big wins, less reactive to losses, less interested in constant performance comparison. That can feel isolating, especially in trading communities where emotion and validation are constantly exchanged. Some people would rather stay emotionally attached than feel disconnected from the group. That's a powerful, often unconscious influence. This is why many traders oscillate. They touch detachment briefly, then retreat back into attachment because it feels familiar. Caring deeply about money gives trading intensity. It makes it feel important. Letting go of that intensity can feel like losing meaning until something else replaces it. And that replacement doesn't come immediately. It comes slowly, through a growing respect for process over outcome. The traders who fully transition start to derive satisfaction from things that used to feel secondary. Clean execution, rule adherence, staying calm through volatility, finishing a session without emotional residue. Those things don't create adrenaline, but they create stability. And stability becomes rewarding once you've experienced the chaos of the alternative long enough. If you're realizing that what's been holding you back isn't lack of knowledge, but emotional entanglement, pause for a moment and like the video. Not as a signal to anyone else, but as a way of acknowledging the shift in perspective. These realizations tend to fade if they're not reinforced, and reinforcement is part of how new patterns form. The reason most traders never reach the psychology of someone who doesn't care about money isn't because it's elite or unattainable. It's because it requires letting go of the belief that money should feel important in the moment. That belief is deeply ingrained. It's reinforced by culture, by community, by personal history. Releasing it can feel like stepping into uncertainty without a safety net. But paradoxically, that's what makes trading safer in the long run. Chapter 4. What replaces money when it stops being the emotional driver is not motivation in the way most people understand it. There's no surge, no hunger, no internal speech about wanting it badly enough. What shows up instead is a quieter pull toward correctness, toward alignment, toward doing the thing the right way even when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. That shift feels anticlimactic if you're used to intensity, but it's far more durable. At first, this replacement feels weak, almost disappointing. You sit down to trade and notice there's no rush, no urgency to prove anything, no emotional payoff waiting on the other side of a win. And your mind asks a dangerous question. Why am I even doing this if it doesn't feel exciting anymore? That question scares people back into attachment faster than almost anything else. Because excitement was never about trading. It was about feeling alive, validated, or in control. When money loses its charge, that stimulation disappears too. The traders who make it through this phase don't rush to fill that gap. They let it exist. They allow trading to feel flat for a while. They don't try to re-inject emotion by sizing up or forcing trades. They don't manufacture pressure to feel motivated again. They let the process become quiet enough that they can actually hear what's left underneath the noise. And what's left is usually something they weren't expecting. Curiosity without urgency, focus without anxiety, engagement without attachment. You can feel this change in how decisions land. When money was emotionally charged, decisions felt heavy. Every choice carried imagined consequences. Now they feel cleaner, more technical, less personal. You're not asking what this trade will do for you. You're asking whether it fits, whether it's aligned, whether it deserves execution. That question is less exciting, but it's also less exhausting. And over time, exhaustion matters more than excitement ever did. There's a subtle pride that starts to replace the old emotional highs. Not pride in results, but pride in restraint. In watching a setup form and choosing not to take it because it doesn't meet criteria. And sitting through a session and doing nothing without feeling like you failed. In closing the platform at the end of the day without replaying decisions in your head. That kind of pride is quiet, but it sticks. It doesn't evaporate with the next loss. This is where consistency becomes possible. Not because you're forcing yourself to be disciplined, but because there's nothing left pulling you away. When money isn't tugging at your emotions, you're free to repeat behavior. And repetition is the real engine of consistency, not motivation, not willpower. Just the ability to do the same thing again tomorrow without negotiating with yourself about whether it's worth it. You might notice that your relationship with risk changes too. Risk becomes clearer, not scarier. You see it as exposure instead of danger, as a parameter instead of a threat. When money mattered emotionally, risk felt like something to avoid or conquer. Now it feels like something to respect and contain. That shift alone removes a huge amount of internal conflict. You're no longer fighting risk emotionally while trying to manage it technically. This phase also strips away a lot of unnecessary identity. You stop thinking of yourself as a trader who wins or loses. You start thinking of yourself as someone who executes, someone who filters, someone who shows up the same way regardless of outcome. That identity is less glamorous, but it's far more stable. It doesn't fluctuate with P&L. It doesn't collapse during drawdowns. It doesn't inflate during winning streaks. The irony is that this is often when performance improves. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're finally not in the way. You're not second-guessing exits. You're not cutting winners early out of fear. You're not holding losers out of hope. You're not chasing missed moves. All of that interference came from caring about what money said about you. When that narrative dissolves, execution becomes cleaner almost by accident. Most people never reach this point because they mistake emotional flatness for lack of progress. They assume if trading doesn't feel intense, it must not be working. They reattach to money to bring the feeling back. They size up. They trade more often. They recreate the same emotional environment that caused problems in the first place. And because that environment feels familiar, it's mistaken for engagement rather than recognized as a trap. There's also a humility that settles in here. You stop trying to outsmart the market. You stop narrating your edge. You stop explaining outcomes. You accept that you're participating in probabilities, not predictions. That acceptance doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels sobering. But sobriety is exactly what allows long-term performance to exist. Drunk confidence burns fast. Sober execution lasts. If you're listening to this and realizing that the version of you who trades best is the one who feels the least, pause and like the video. Not because it's inspirational, but because it's clarifying. These insights don't hype you up. They settle you down. And that settling is the entire point of this psychological shift. The traders who stop caring about money don't lose ambition. They lose desperation. They're still committed. They're still focused. They still want to improve. But they're no longer asking trading to solve emotional problems it was never meant to solve. That separation is what allows engagement to become sustainable instead of volatile. This is also where life outside trading starts to matter again. When money isn't dictating mood, your day doesn't revolve around outcomes. Wins don't elevate you, losses don't drain you. Trading becomes one part of life instead of the thing that colors everything else. That balance isn't just healthy, it's protective. It prevents burnout, obsession, and the slow erosion of discipline that comes from emotional fatigue. Chapter 5. At some point, you notice that the screen no longer pulls at you the way it used to. Not because you care less about doing things right, but because there's nothing left to react to emotionally. Price moves and you observe it. A trade sets up and you evaluate it. A position plays out and you manage it. There's no internal narration about what this means for your future, your confidence, or your sense of progress. The absence of that narration is subtle, but it changes everything about how trading feels day to day. You stop waking up thinking about money, not in a forced way, not as a disciplined practice, but naturally. The urge just fades. Trading becomes something you do during a defined window, instead of something that follows you around mentally all day. You're not replaying trades while you eat. You're not checking charts reflexively. You're not measuring your worth by how the last session went. That mental space comes back, and with it comes clarity you didn't realize you were missing. This is what people misunderstand when they hear that the best traders don't care about money. They assume it means detachment from results. It doesn't. Results still matter, just not emotionally. They matter structurally, statistically, over time. A loss is processed as part of a distribution, not a personal event. A win is logged and forgotten just as quickly. Nothing lingers long enough to distort the next decision. That's the real advantage. Not confidence, but cleanliness. There's also a shift in how mistakes feel. When money mattered emotionally, mistakes carried shame. They felt like evidence of something being wrong with you. Now they feel informative, neutral, almost mechanical. You notice them, adjust if needed, and move on. There's no spiral, no self-criticism, no urge to compensate. That emotional neutrality around error is one of the strongest indicators that money no longer has psychological authority over your behavior. You might notice that you no longer feel the need to talk about trading as much. Not because you're hiding anything, but because there's less emotional charge to discharge. You're not seeking validation. You're not trying to explain yourself. You're not looking for reassurance. Trading has settled into a routine, and routines don't demand commentary. This is often when people around you assume you've lost interest, when in reality you've just lost the need to perform. What replaces that performance is quiet confidence. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the kind that shows up as consistency. You trust that you'll behave the same way tomorrow regardless of how today went. You trust that a bad session won't provoke overreaction. You trust that a good one won't tempt you into pressing. That trust isn't belief. It's evidence-based. It comes from watching yourself handle a wide range of outcomes without deviating. This is also when trading starts to feel oddly simple. Not easy, but simple. The complexity that used to overwhelm you turns out to have been emotional, not technical. Once money stops amplifying every decision, the market becomes easier to read because you're no longer projecting meaning onto every move. You see structure instead of opportunity, context instead of urgency, and that shift improves execution without any additional effort. The irony is that this mindset often arrives after people stop actively chasing it. Trying to not care about money keeps money central. The shift happens when caring becomes exhausting, when the emotional cost is finally clear enough that detachment feels like relief rather than loss. That relief is what allows the mindset to stick. It's not adopted, it's earned through experience and fatigue. There's a moment where you realize that if the account went to zero tomorrow, it wouldn't devastate you the way it once would have. Not because you're careless, but because your identity isn't tied to the number anymore. You'd be disappointed. You'd analyze what happened. You'd rebuild. But you wouldn't collapse. That resilience doesn't come from confidence in winning. It comes from confidence in your process and your ability to repeat it. This is why traders who reach this state tend to last. Not because they're immune to losses, but because losses don't derail them emotionally. They don't need to recover psychologically before they can recover financially. They don't carry baggage from one session into the next. Each day starts clean. That cleanliness compounds just as powerfully as capital does over time. If you're listening to this and thinking it sounds distant from where you are now, that's okay. Most people don't start here, they arrive here after caring too much for too long, after learning the hard way that emotional attachment doesn't create better outcomes. If this perspective feels unfamiliar but strangely appealing, sit with that. Don't rush to apply it. Awareness comes first. Behavior follows later. This is also where you realize that the goal was never to stop caring about money entirely. The goal was to stop letting it decide how you feel and how you act. Money returns to its proper role, a tool, a measure, a resource, not a judge, not a motivator, not a threat. Once it's back in that role, trading becomes manageable in a way it never was before. If this video gave language to something you felt but never articulated, hit like. Not as endorsement, but as recognition. Naming a pattern is often the first step toward loosening its grip. And if you want more conversations that go beneath tactics and into what actually determines long-term behavior, subscribe. This channel is about understanding the internal shifts that make consistency possible, not just the external rules that look good on paper. The psychology of a trader who doesn't care about money isn't cold or indifferent. It's calm, grounded, unreactive. It's the psychology of someone who's finally stopped asking trading to fulfill emotional needs it was never designed to meet. And once that happens, everything else gets easier to manage. Not because the market changes, but because the person interacting with it finally does.